They say life can change in the blink of an eye. Sometimes, it's a stroke of luck you never saw coming. Other times, it's the blinding red and blue of a police cruiser, sirens wailing, signaling the beginning of a nightmare. For Malcolm Hayes, it was the latter. At 36, Malcolm was a man of discipline, a black man who carried himself with quiet authority. He was tall, sharp-eyed, and always composed, a presence that could silence an entire conference room the moment he spoke. Yet, for someone who commanded such respect in high-level meetings, Malcolm preferred to blend into the background in everyday life. After all, that was the nature of his work. As one of the highest-ranking intelligence officials in the National Security Agency, Malcolm had mastered the art of invisibility. His job required it. But no amount of training could have prepared him for what was about to happen. That Tuesday morning had begun like any other. He had taken the day off, planning to drive to Prince George's County, the place he grew up. It was a rare moment for him, giving back to the community through a volunteer cybersecurity workshop at a local youth center. The drive was peaceful at first. The roads were mostly empty, the cool spring air drifting through his slightly cracked window. A cup of black coffee rested in his console, a familiar companion on long drives. Local news played on the radio, discussing efforts to improve police-community relations. The irony was almost laughable. Then he saw them, a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. It wasn't unusual. He'd been cautious, sticking to the speed limit, making every turn with precision. But when the cruiser followed his lane changes, a chill crept up his spine. His instincts, honed from years of intelligence work, whispered that something was off. Then, as expected, the flashing lights ignited. A voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Pull over." Malcolm complied without hesitation, easing his car onto the shoulder. He turned off the ignition and exhaled slowly, willing his pulse to steady. Nothing triggers caution in a black motorist like an unexpected police stop. He reminded himself of the rules: stay calm, keep both hands visible, comply. His job at the NSA meant he'd briefed others on situations like this, but he never thought he'd be the one living it. The driver's side door swung open, and two officers approached, one at his window, the other circling behind. The first officer leaned in. Badge: Officer David Talbot. Stocky, mid-40s, eyes sharp with suspicion. License and registration, he barked. Malcolm nodded, moving slowly as he retrieved his wallet and handed over his credentials. Talbot examined the license for a beat longer than necessary, his thick eyebrows furrowing. "Were you headed in such a hurry?" Malcolm barely suppressed a frown. He wasn't speeding. At most, he had been 2 miles over the limit. Not nearly enough to justify a stop. "Just visiting the community center," he replied evenly. Talbot didn't acknowledge the response. Instead, he stepped away, exchanging a few hushed words with his partner, Officer Anthony Morales, a tall, silent figure lingering near the back of Malcolm's car. Malcolm knew a setup when he saw one. Then, Talbot returned. His expression had shifted, more rigid, more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm's stomach tightened. This wasn't routine anymore. Still, he complied. The moment he was on his feet, Talbot's tone turned sharp. "You got anything illegal on you?" Malcolm's eyebrows lifted slightly. "No, officer." It didn't matter. Talbot patted him down right there on the side of the road, in full view of passing cars. It was humiliating, but Malcolm bit back his anger. Reacting would only make things worse. Then, Morales popped the trunk without asking. The real game had begun. Malcolm watched with trained focus as Morales rummaged through his belongings: a laptop, a set of cables, a few tools for his workshop. Nothing suspicious. Then, as if on cue, Talbot made a grand display of pulling out a small plastic bag from the trunk. A bag of white powder. Malcolm's breath left him. "What the hell?" Talbot turned, shaking the bag in front of him. Well, what do we have here?" Malcolm's mind raced. This was a classic frame-up. He had never seen that bag before in his life. His pulse hammered, but his voice remained measured. "That's not mine." Morales smirked. "Yeah, they all say that." This wasn't an arrest. It was an execution of character. Talbot stepped closer. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." For a split second, Malcolm considered revealing his real identity, pulling out the NSA card, shutting this down before it escalated. But he knew better. Revealing who he was would only raise more questions, more scrutiny. He had spent years mastering the art of discretion. Now, That very skill was working against him. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. His rights were read, but it felt like a script, something these officers had recited 100 times before, never expecting anyone to challenge them. As they shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, Malcolm stared out the window, his mind racing. Why him? Why now? He had spent his career analyzing threats, deconstructing enemy motives. But this wasn't a foreign adversary. This was his own backyard. And right now, Malcolm Hayes wasn't an intelligence officer. He was just another black man in handcuffs. And they had no idea just how badly they had miscalculated. The police station was small, old, and reeked of something sour and stagnant: sweat, frustration, maybe even corruption itself. Malcolm Hayes was led inside, his wrists still bound in cold steel. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a dull, incessant hum, casting harsh shadows against the tiled floor. Around him, officers moved with the casual indifference of men who had done this 1,000 times before. To them, he was just another arrest, another statistic. They had no idea. Officer Talbot yanked Malcolm forward, forcing him to a stop in front of a heavy desk where a stout, balding sergeant sat reviewing paperwork. "Suspect found in possession of a controlled substance," Talbot recited, his voice devoid of any real emotion. "Resisted arrest." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Resisted arrest? That was a lie. Talbot knew it. Morales knew it. Every cop in this station probably knew it. But the sergeant barely glanced up. He just nodded, stamping a form with a loud, mechanical thud. Business as usual. Malcolm swallowed down his anger. Now wasn't the time. Talbot finally unlocked the cuffs, rubbing his own wrist as if Malcolm had actually put up a fight. "Print him." Malcolm was shoved toward a booking station, his fingers pressed into black ink, then rolled onto a form. Next came the mugshot. He caught a glimpse of himself in the reflective surface of the camera. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. This was a setup, and the only thing keeping him from tearing this place apart brick by brick was control. He knew how systems worked, and he knew how to break them. For now, he just needed to wait for his moment. The holding cell. A guard escorted Malcolm down a dimly lit corridor, stopping at a steel-barred door. The lock clanked open, and Malcolm was pushed inside. The cell was small, cramped, the air heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies and old regret. 3 men were already there, 2 pacing, 1 slumped in a corner. They barely looked up. Malcolm kept to himself, taking a seat on the worn bench along the back wall. He needed to think. Talbot and Morales hadn't just arrested him. They had chosen him. But why? Was it random? Had his license plate been flagged somewhere? Or did someone actually know who he was? Malcolm had spent years hunting threats, dismantling networks of corruption, tracking bad actors before they could move against national security. Now he was the one being hunted. And that meant this was bigger than 2 crooked cops. He needed to get a message out. To the one person who could make this all disappear in an instant. The phone call. It took hours before the guard finally returned. 1 call. Malcolm stood, his shoulders tight as he was led to a desk where an old, battered phone sat. The desk sergeant smirked. He didn't think Malcolm had anyone to call. He was wrong. Malcolm picked up the receiver, dialing a number from memory. It rang twice. Then, a calm, steady voice answered. "Hayes." Malcolm exhaled. Robert Harding, his closest ally, his right hand, and, ironically, his direct subordinate. To the world, Robert Harding was just another top-level bureaucrat, an analyst with a deep background in cyber intelligence and counterespionage. But inside the NSA, he was the man Malcolm trusted most. And right now, he was the only person who could get him the hell out of here. Malcolm kept his voice even, disguising any urgency. He knew the line was being monitored. "It's me," he said, letting a slight unease creep into his tone. "I need help." A pause. Then Robert asked, "Where are you?" Malcolm leaned against the desk. "Prince George's County Station. They say I had something in my trunk." Another pause. Then, Robert's tone shifted. Focused. Sharp. Ready. "Understood. Sit tight." The line went dead. The shift in power. Malcolm replaced the receiver, turning to see the sergeant watching him with mild amusement. "Your lawyer?" the man asked mockingly. Malcolm just offered a tight smile. Something like that. Then he was escorted back to the cell, settling into the same seat as before. His fellow inmates barely stirred. They didn't realize what had just happened. They didn't realize this entire situation had just shifted. Talbot and Morales thought they had arrested some nobody on a quiet road. They had no idea they had just placed one of the most powerful intelligence officers in the country behind bars. And now, the storm was coming. The holding cell was silent, but Malcolm Hayes' mind was anything but. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled, but beneath the surface, his thoughts were moving at 1,000 miles per hour. The moment he had made that phone call, the game had changed. Talbot and Morales thought they had caught an easy target. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The waiting game. Malcolm sat, unmoving, against the cold cement wall. The other inmates in the cell barely acknowledged him. One of them, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, muttered something about cops always messing with black men for nothing before going back to his restless pacing. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew that truth all too well. But this wasn't just another case of racial profiling. This was targeted, planned. The only question was by whom. He needed information, and information always came to those who waited. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Robert Harding moved like a man on a mission. The moment he hung up with Malcolm, he was already dialing his next call. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "This is Danielle Glass." A high-powered defense attorney, sharp as a scalpel and just as lethal in the courtroom. Robert wasted no time. "I need you in Prince George's County immediately. A friend of mine has been arrested under false charges." Danielle barely hesitated. "Who's the friend?" Robert's voice was calm but heavy. "Malcolm Hayes." Silence. Then, in a lower, more serious tone, she said, "I'll be there in an hour." Robert ended the call and leaned back in his seat, fingers steepled in thought. He had known Malcolm for years, and he knew one thing for certain. If someone was bold enough to frame him, this wasn't random. This was part of a much bigger play. Back at the station, Malcolm had been waiting for nearly 2 hours when Talbot and Morales finally appeared again. They walked in like they owned the place, smug satisfaction dripping from their expressions. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched them. Talbot leaned against the bars. "How's our guest doing?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "You tell me. You're the hosts, after all." Talbot's smirk faltered for a split second. Then Morales spoke. "You're in a lot of trouble, you know that?" Malcolm didn't answer. He knew how this worked. They wanted him rattled, wanted him desperate. They weren't getting either. Talbot's fingers tapped against the bars, an uneven rhythm filling the silence. "See, guys like you, you're all the same." He smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "You think you're special. You think you're untouchable. But out here, on these streets, we make the rules." Malcolm held his gaze. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. His voice was calm, controlled. "I think you should enjoy this moment, Officer Talbot." Talbot's smirk returned. "Oh yeah? Why's that?" Malcolm let the silence stretch before answering. "Because it's the last time you're going to feel like you're in control." For the first time, Morales looked uneasy. Talbot, however, scoffed. "Tough guy, huh?" He pushed off the bars and turned to leave. "We'll see how tough you are when the DA throws the book at you." The door slammed shut behind them. Malcolm leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. He had just watched 2 men dig their own graves. The arrival of power. 30 minutes later, the station doors burst open. Danielle Glass entered first. She was tall, poised, and dressed in a crisp black suit that screamed authority. Right behind her, Robert Harding followed, his expression unreadable. The desk sergeant barely had time to react before Danielle was already flashing a document. "I am here as legal counsel for Malcolm Hayes. I want him released immediately." The sergeant blinked, clearly caught off guard. Miss Glass, we..." She cut him off with a sharp glare. "You what? Planted evidence on my client? Fabricated a story to justify an illegal arrest?" The sergeant swallowed. He wasn't prepared for this. Then, Talbot stepped into the room. His smugness faltered slightly when he saw who had arrived. Robert walked past him without a word, stopping in front of the sergeant's desk. "Release him," he said simply. Talbot laughed. "You think you can just walk in here and now?" Robert turned. And for the first time that night, Talbot realized something was wrong. Robert wasn't just some concerned friend. He carried himself like a man who was used to being in charge. A man who had power. Danielle folded her arms. "If you don't release my client, we will file an immediate motion to suppress all evidence." Talbot rolled his eyes. "Go ahead. We have an airtight case." "No," Robert said softly. "You don't." He set a leather folder down on the desk, opened it, and slid a document forward. Talbot frowned and picked it up. His face turned pale. The sergeant leaned over and instantly stiffened. It was a federal inquiry order, signed by the Department of Justice. Danielle's voice was ice cold. We've already opened an investigation into the misconduct of Officers Talbot and Morales. If Malcolm Hayes is not released within the next 5 minutes, this entire station will be under federal review before morning. Talbot stared. He had lost. Freedom for now. The cell doors swung open. Malcolm stepped out, rubbing his wrist where the cuffs had been. He locked eyes with Talbot. The officer's jaw was clenched, but he said nothing. Because he knew. The storm was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Malcolm turned and walked out of the station, his step steady, his expression unreadable. Robert and Danielle followed closely behind. The cold night air hit Malcolm's skin, but he barely noticed. Because now, the real work began. Talbot and Morales had tried to frame the wrong man, and Malcolm Hayes was about to make damn sure they paid for it. The black sedan cruised through the dimly lit streets of Prince George's County, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. Malcolm Hayes sat in the back seat, his mind laser-focused, his fingers tapping absently against his knee. Robert Harding sat beside him, scrolling through documents on a secure tablet, his expression unreadable. In the driver's seat, Danielle Glass adjusted the rearview mirror, glancing at Malcolm. "You okay?" she asked. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Physically, he was fine. Mentally, he was calculating every possible move, every possible outcome. He exhaled slowly. "I will be." Danielle nodded, her eyes sharp. "Then let's talk about how we end these bastards. The bigger picture." Robert flipped the tablet around, revealing a list of complaints, financial records, and suspicious transactions linked to Talbot and Morales. Malcolm's gaze darkened as he skimmed the files. Excessive force. Unlawful searches. Missing body cam footage. And yet, neither officer had ever faced serious consequences. Danielle leaned forward. "Here's what we know. Talbot and Morales are dirty, but they're not just planting drugs for fun. There's money moving behind the scenes, large sums deposited into an LLC tied to a local crime syndicate." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "They're working for someone." Robert nodded. "Exactly. And given your arrest, I'd say someone in that network flagged you as a problem." Danielle sat back, her eyes thoughtful. "That means two things. One, they know who you are. Or at least, they suspect you're not just some random guy. And two, they're willing to risk everything to get rid of you." Malcolm absorbed the information. His arrest hadn't been random. It was a preemptive strike, which meant whoever was behind this thought he was already close to uncovering something big. Good. Let them think that. Because now, he would make sure it became the truth. Building the case. Danielle folded her arms. "First, we take care of your charges. Even though we got you out, the case is still technically open. The DA is going to double down, especially if Talbot and Morales push their story." Robert smirked. "They won't have a story much longer." He tapped the tablet screen, pulling up a hidden file, one that had been recovered from a secondary police body cam. Malcolm's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. The unedited footage showed Morales slipping the plastic bag into Malcolm's trunk. Clear as day. Danielle let out a sharp breath. "Jesus. This isn't just a planted evidence case. This is career-ending." Malcolm met Robert's gaze. "How soon can we use this?" Robert considered. "Depends. If we play it now, it'll immediately clear you, but it might tip them off that we're digging deeper. If we wait, we can keep building the case and take down the entire network." Malcolm exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "We wait." Danielle arched a brow. "You sure? That means you're still technically under suspicion." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "I don't just want to clear my name. I want to burn down whatever they're building." Robert gave a small, approving nod. "Then we do this the hard way. The bait." Malcolm leaned forward. "We need to push them. Force their hand." Danielle frowned. "Meaning?" Malcolm's smile was cold. "Calculated. I want them to know I'm coming for them." Robert chuckled. "That's risky." Malcolm tilted his head. "Not if we control the board." Danielle glanced between them. "Okay, genius. How do you plan to do that?" Malcolm's fingers drummed against his knee. "By making sure they think I already have everything I need." Silence filled the car as the weight of the plan settled. Then Robert smirked. "You really are a bastard, you know that?" Malcolm just smiled. "Let's set the trap." The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that came before a storm. Malcolm Hayes sat at his dining table, the glow of his secure laptop illuminating his face. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested beside him, untouched. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, sending a flurry of encrypted messages through a private NSA channel. Across the table, Robert Harding watched him work, his own tablet pulled up with live surveillance feeds of Prince George's County. Every move Talbot and Morales made was being tracked. Danielle Glass was pacing near the window, her arms crossed, deep in thought. It had been less than 24 hours since Malcolm had walked out of that police station. And now, it was his turn to move first. "They're already nervous," Robert said, tilting his screen to show an image of Morales meeting with an unknown man behind a rundown warehouse. Danielle stopped pacing. "Who's the friend?" Robert zoomed in. "Name's Eric Voss. Dirty real estate guy. He's been laundering money through shell companies for years, ties to narcotics and underground weapons sales. We think he's the one paying Talbot and Morales under the table." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Then he's the one who gave the order to frame me." Robert nodded. "Most likely. And if he did, he'll want confirmation that you're either scared, locked up, or dead." Malcolm sat back, his fingers steepled. "Let's make sure he thinks I'm none of those things." Danielle smirked. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Malcolm allowed himself a slow, deliberate smile. "They came for me first. Now I return the favor. Step 1, the message." Malcolm tapped a command on his laptop. Seconds later, every screen inside the Prince George's County police station flickered and turned black. A moment later, a message appeared on all monitors. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? I know who you work for. Your time is running out." The reaction. Inside the station, panic erupted. Talbot and Morales were in the break room when the message flashed across their phones, their desktops, even their patrol car systems. Talbot's face turned red. "What the hell is this?" Morales swore under his breath. "It's him." They had arrested Malcolm thinking he was just another black man caught in the system. Now, they were realizing just how badly they had miscalculated. Talbot grabbed his phone, dialing furiously. "Voss, we have a problem." Step 2, the pressure. An hour later, Eric Voss was pacing inside his office, his phone clutched in a tight grip. "What do you mean? He hacked the station?" he snapped at Talbot. "Exactly what I said," Talbot growled. "He's coming after us." Voss' eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. We planted the evidence. He should be on his knees begging for a deal." "Yeah, well, he's not. And if he's making moves, that means he knows something." Voss ran a hand through his thinning hair. This was not how things were supposed to go. Malcolm Hayes was supposed to be destroyed. Instead, he was fighting back. Voss turned to the shadowed figure standing near his desk. "Make sure he's silenced. For good." Step 3, the ambush. Back at Malcolm's house, Robert's phone buzzed with an incoming alert. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. They took the bait. Malcolm's lips twitched in satisfaction. "How many?" Robert tapped his screen. 2 hitters, moving fast. ETA 15 minutes. Danielle swore. "They're sending people to kill you already?" Malcolm stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Good. Saves me the trouble of finding them first." He turned toward the coat rack near his door, pulling down a sleek, custom-fit bulletproof vest. Danielle stared. "You always keep one of those near your front door?" Malcolm smirked. "Only when I piss off dangerous people." Robert was already moving, checking his sidearm. Danielle sighed, rubbing her temples. "You two are insane." Malcolm slid his gun into its holster. "No, we're just better at this than they are." The trap was set. The hunters were coming. And Malcolm Hayes was ready. The house was silent, bathed in shadows. Malcolm Hayes stood in his darkened living room, calm, waiting. Across from him, Robert Harding crouched near the window, his eyes on the security feed streaming on his tablet. Outside, 2 men in dark clothing were moving toward the house, staying low, their movements precise. Danielle Glass stood near the hallway, arms crossed, her jaw tight. "I can't believe this is happening." Malcolm smirked. "You expected them to let me walk away?" Danielle shook her head. "No, but I didn't expect them to be this reckless." Robert checked his sidearm, his voice steady. "Desperate men make stupid decisions." Malcolm nodded. "And these two just made the last one of their careers." The attack begins. Outside, the hitmen reached the front door. One of them, a bald man with a scar down his jawline, raised his gloved hand and gave a signal. His partner, leaner, quicker, eyes sharp with tension, reached into his jacket and pulled out a suppressed pistol. They moved fast, silent. But inside, Malcolm was faster. He reached for the hidden control panel under his desk, tapped a single button. and suddenly, the entire house went dark. Chaos in the dark. The two men froze, caught off guard as the streetlight outside cut off, the security cameras shorted out, and the house was plunged into pitch blackness. Scarface cursed under his breath. What the hell? The leaner man pulled his gun closer, scanning the darkness. He's ready for us. Scarface gritted his teeth. Doesn't matter. We finished the job. They moved inside. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the house, guns raised. Their footsteps barely made a sound against the hardwood floor. The house was silent. Too silent. Then, a low voice cut through the darkness. You should have stayed home. Malcolm strikes first. Before the first gunman could react, Malcolm moved. He came from the shadows, striking fast and hard, his fist colliding with Scarface's wrist. The gun went off, puffed, but the silencer muffled the shot. The bullet buried itself harmlessly into the couch. Malcolm twisted, driving his elbow into Scarface's ribs, forcing him backward. The lean man reacted quickly, swinging his pistol toward Malcolm, but before he could fire, Robert appeared from the hallway, tackling him straight into the wall. The house erupted into a brutal, silent fight. Scarface lunged for Malcolm again, his knife flashing in the dim light. But Malcolm was already 2 steps ahead. He sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted, hard. The knife clattered to the floor. Malcolm slammed his knee into Scarface's gut, sending him crashing into the kitchen table. Meanwhile, Robert drove his fist into the second man's jaw, sending him staggering. The hitman recovered quickly, spinning his gun back toward Robert. Bang! Danielle fired. The suppressed round hit the man squarely in the shoulder, and he crumpled with a strangled gasp. Scarface, still groaning on the floor, reached for his fallen knife. Malcolm kicked it away. Then he crouched down, his eyes cold. Who sent you? Scarface spat blood, sneering. Go to hell. Malcolm just smiled. You first. Then he knocked the man unconscious with a single punch. The aftermath. The house was still again. Only now, 2 bodies lay on the floor, one unconscious, one writhing in pain. Robert let out a slow breath. Well, that was fun. Danielle glared at him. Fun? That was insane. Malcolm stood, adjusting his sleeves. Maybe, but it told us what we needed to know. Danielle narrowed her eyes. And what exactly is that? Malcolm smirked. We have them scared. The living room was a mess. A broken chair, a shattered lamp, and 2 bodies on the floor. One groaning in pain, the other completely unconscious. Malcolm Hayes exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he stepped over the unconscious hitman. The adrenaline was still humming in his veins, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. Robert Harding stood by the window, scanning the street for any backup that might be on the way. Danielle Glass, still holding her gun, gave Malcolm a look. Now what? Malcolm crouched down, grabbing the conscious hitman by the collar. The man gritted his teeth, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His left arm hung awkwardly, a shattered shoulder, courtesy of Danielle's bullet. Malcolm's voice was calm, measured, deadly. You have one chance to make it out of this alive. The man spat on the floor. Screw you. Malcolm smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Wrong answer. He stood up and turned to Robert. Bag. Robert nodded and tossed a black duffel onto the table. Malcolm unzipped it, revealing a laptop, a small tablet, and a portable signal jammer. The hitman's eyes flickered with uncertainty. This wasn't what he expected. Malcolm powered up the laptop. You know who I am, don't you? Silence. Then, the man nodded once. Malcolm leaned in. Good. Then you know what I can do. He turned the laptop toward the hitman, showing a live feed from the man's own phone. His call logs, his texts, his emails. A single message, highlighted in red, stood out. Voss, take him out tonight. No loose ends. The hitman's face lost its color. Danielle's eyebrows shot up. That was easy. Robert smirked. They never expect us to already have their data. Malcolm turned the screen back toward himself, closing the feed. Then he crouched down again, his voice low. Dangerous. Your boss sent you to kill me. That means you know something. Now, you tell me what I need to know, and maybe, just maybe, you live to see tomorrow. The hitman hesitated. Malcolm sighed, standing up. Or don't. I'm sure your employer will appreciate how loyal you were, until he realizes you failed. And trust me, I am a much kinder man than whoever he is cleaning up his mistakes. That did it. The man swallowed hard. Voss. He's got cops, politicians, business owners, all in his pocket. Malcolm's expression didn't change. And what's his real business? The hitman coughed, wincing as his injured shoulder throbbed. Drugs mostly, but it's bigger than that. The precinct helps him control the streets. They make sure the right people get arrested, the right people get released. It's all part of the operation. Danielle shook her head. And planting drugs in Malcolm's car? The hitman's gaze darted to her. Then to Malcolm. You weren't supposed to walk away. A tense silence filled the room. Robert was the first to speak. Sounds like Voss was worried you'd figure out what he was up to. Malcolm nodded slowly. And now he has every reason to be afraid. Rewriting the rules. Malcolm stepped back, arms crossed. Where's Voss now? The hitman hesitated, then sighed. He's got a warehouse near the docks. That's where the real operation is. Malcolm glanced at Robert, who was already typing into his tablet. Got it. I'll pull up satellite imagery. Danielle sighed, rubbing her temples. So what? We just stormed the place? Because last time I checked, we're not law enforcement. Malcolm smirked. No, we're better. Danielle rolled her eyes. Of course you'd say that. Robert glanced at Malcolm. We could pass this to the FBI. Malcolm shook his head. Not yet. We don't know how deep this runs. If we expose this too early, someone will bury the evidence before we can stop them. Danielle frowned. So what's the plan? Malcolm looked at the hitman. We make sure Voss knows that the game has changed. The warning shot. Malcolm reached for the hitman's phone and pulled up Voss' number. Then he dialed. The room was silent as the line rang. Then, a click. Voss' voice came through, sharp and impatient. Is it done? Malcolm smiled. Not quite. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, Voss spoke again, his voice lower. Who is this? Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. The man you tried to kill. A slow, sharp inhale from the other end. Voss had not expected this. Malcolm's voice remained calm. Deadly. You should have made sure I was dead, Voss. Because now, I'm coming for you. Voss exhaled sharply. You think you can threaten me? Malcolm chuckled. No, I don't threaten. I promise. Then he hung up. And just like that, the hunt had begun. The phone call was a declaration of war. Malcolm Hayes had no intention of hiding. He wasn't a man who ran. And now, Voss knew that. The game was no longer about survival. It was about control. Voss had tried to eliminate him. Now, Malcolm would tear his entire empire apart. The warehouse. The digital map flickered to life on Robert Harding's tablet. A satellite image zoomed in on a location near the docks, an old warehouse, surrounded by shipping containers and a fenced perimeter. Danielle Glass leaned over his shoulder. That's their base. The hitman, still slumped against the wall, his shoulder bleeding, nodded weakly. Yeah, that's where they move everything. Drugs, money, weapons. You hit them there, you hit them hard. Malcolm studied the image, memorizing every detail. One entrance, a rear-loading dock, multiple escape routes. Robert tapped the screen. There are at least 10 guys on site, maybe more. Security cameras, armed guards. This won't be easy. Danielle folded her arms. You're not seriously thinking of going in alone, are you? Malcolm smirked. Of course not. I have you too. Danielle sighed, rubbing her temples. Why did I ever agree to help you? Robert chuckled. Because you hate dirty cops and corrupt businessmen almost as much as we do. Danielle exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. The setup. Malcolm moved fast. Within an hour, the three of them had set up a mobile operations center inside a rented SUV, parked a few blocks from the warehouse. Robert worked his magic, hacking into the warehouse's security cameras and redirecting their feeds. Danielle double-checked her firearm. Malcolm? He was already in motion. The infiltration. The docks were quiet at night, the air thick with the scent of salt water and gasoline. Malcolm moved like a shadow, slipping through gaps in the fencing, staying low between stacked shipping containers. Up ahead, two guards stood near the warehouse entrance, smoking and chatting. Malcolm pulled out his phone, tapped a command. A security alarm blared from the opposite end of the lot. The guards spun toward the noise. Malcolm struck fast. The first man didn't even have time to react before Malcolm's elbow slammed into his temple, knocking him out cold. The second turned, reaching for his gun, but Malcolm's fist found his throat first. A quick, efficient takedown. Inside the beast's lair, Malcolm slipped through the warehouse doors. Inside, stacks of crates lined the walls, each one marked with coded numbers. drugs, money, weapons, and standing in the middle of it all, barking orders into a phone. Eric Voss. Malcolm's lips curled into a smile. Perfect. But he wasn't the only one inside. At least 8 men stood between him and his target. Good. He needed the exercise. The warehouse hummed with tension. Stacks of illicit cargo, drugs, money, and weapons lined the metal shelves. Dim industrial lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. At the center of it all, Eric Voss stood with his back turned, barking orders into his phone. Malcolm Hayes stayed hidden, his eyes sweeping the room. 8 men, armed, positioned between him and Voss. A direct assault was suicide, but Malcolm wasn't here for a fair fight. The first strike. From his pocket, Malcolm pulled out a small black device, a signal jammer. One tap. Every phone in the building went dead. Voss froze, glancing at his screen. What the? Then, Malcolm moved. He launched a metal canister across the warehouse. Boom. The flashbang exploded, filling the air with blinding light and deafening noise. The guards stumbled, disoriented. Malcolm sprinted forward. The chaos unfolds. One of Voss' men recovered first, pulling his weapon. Malcolm grabbed his wrist before he could fire, twisting it until he heard a sickening pop. The gun clattered to the floor. Malcolm drove his knee into the man's stomach, then flipped him onto the concrete. One down. Another guard charged, swinging a crowbar. Malcolm ducked, grabbed a crate, and smashed it against the man's head. 2 down. Gunfire erupted. Bullets slammed into crates, sending splinters into the air. Malcolm darted behind cover, his heartbeat steady. From the alley outside, Robert Harding's voice crackled through the earpiece. "We hear gunfire. You good?" Malcolm grinned. "Peachy." Robert sighed. "We're moving in." Voss runs. Voss was already backing toward the loading dock, his face pale. He wasn't a fighter. He was a businessman in a dirty empire, and now that empire was burning down around him. He turned and ran. Malcolm saw him go. But first, he had to finish the others. The final guard. Only one gunman was left standing. He raised his rifle, aiming straight for Malcolm's head. Bang! A single shot rang out. The man collapsed. Malcolm turned to see Danielle Glass standing in the entrance, gun smoking. She blew a loose strand of hair from her face. "You're welcome." Malcolm smirked. "Took you long enough." She holstered her weapon. "Next time, don't go in alone." The chase begins. Voss' footsteps echoed as he ran toward an escape vehicle idling behind the warehouse. Malcolm was right behind him. He wouldn't let the man escape. Not tonight. Eric Voss ran. His dress shoes pounded against the wet pavement, breath ragged, heart hammering. He wasn't built for this. He was a man of money, of influence, of connections. But none of that mattered now, because Malcolm Hayes was coming for him. The pursuit. Voss raced toward his escape vehicle, a sleek black SUV idling behind the warehouse. A driver waited inside, door open, engine rumbling. Just a few more steps. Then, a dark figure moved in the corner of his vision. Too fast, too quiet. Malcolm slammed into him, tackling him hard onto the pavement. Voss hit the ground with a choked gasp, his head bouncing against the asphalt. His driver panicked, throwing the SUV into gear. Before the tires could screech away, bang! A single gunshot rang out. The driver jerked forward, a bullet lodged in his shoulder. Danielle Glass stood a few feet away, her gun raised. "That's not your ride anymore, Voss." The SUV swerved and crashed into a stack of metal crates. The driver wasn't going anywhere. Voss' desperation. Voss coughed, rolling onto his back. You don't understand." Malcolm grabbed him by the collar, lifting him up just enough for their eyes to meet. "Then explain it to me." Voss gasped for air. "It's bigger than me, Hayes. You take me down, someone else will take my place." Malcolm's grip tightened. "I'll take them down, too." Voss swallowed, his mind racing. He had one last card to play. "You think I'm the head of this," he wheezed. "You think I make the calls?" Malcolm stared at him, expression unreadable. Voss forced a smile, blood on his teeth. "You're playing in the wrong league. This operation? It's national. Maybe international. You can't stop it." Malcolm let that sink in. Then, with deliberate force, he slammed Voss against the pavement again. "You underestimate me." Voss groaned in pain, but his eyes still held defiance. "If you kill me, you'll never find out who's really in charge." Malcolm let out a slow breath. Then, a smirk. "Who said anything about killing you?" The arrival of justice. The distant wail of sirens filled the air. Voss froze. What did you do? Malcolm leaned in. Made a phone call. Lights flashed in the distance, police cars, FBI units. Voss' face drained of color. He turned to run again. Malcolm grabbed him, spun him around, and slammed him against the SUV. Handcuffs clicked into place. Danielle smirked. Tough break, Voss. The first FBI agent stepped out, gun drawn. Eric Voss, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and federal racketeering. Voss shook his head violently. Wait, you don't understand. I can talk. I can now. The agents dragged him away. His empire was gone. The aftermath. Malcolm watched as Voss was thrown into the back of an armored van. Robert Harding stepped up beside him, arms crossed. Think he'll talk? Malcolm exhaled. Doesn't matter. We have everything we need. Danielle raised a brow. And if there really is someone bigger pulling the strings? Malcolm smirked. Then we keep hunting. Danielle shook her head. You're insane? You know that? Robert grinned. Yeah, but he's damn good at it. Malcolm watched as the convoy of law enforcement vehicles disappeared into the night. Voss was finished. The corruption was exposed. But deep down, Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The night air was thick with the scent of oil and salt water from the nearby docks. The flashing red and blue lights faded in the distance as the FBI convoy carried Eric Voss away. Malcolm Hayes stood still, his mind processing every detail of what had just happened. Voss was done. His corrupt cops, his drug pipeline, his entire operation shattered. But something wasn't sitting right. Robert Harding closed his tablet with a satisfied sigh. Well, that was satisfying. Danielle Glass holstered her gun. Voss is going to start snitching the moment they put him in an interrogation room. That should keep the feds busy for a while. Malcolm didn't move. His gut told him this wasn't over. Robert picked up on it. What's wrong? Malcolm exhaled slowly. Voss said this was bigger than him. Danielle shrugged. Of course he did. They always say that when they're caught. Malcolm shook his head. No, he wasn't bluffing. Robert frowned. What are you thinking? Malcolm stared at the darkened warehouse. Voss had been running a well-oiled operation, but he wasn't a mastermind. Someone had given him power. And now, that someone would realize Malcolm had just burned their network to the ground. Danielle's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. You might be right. Malcolm and Robert turned to her. She lifted the phone, showing them a single text message from an unknown number. You don't know what you've started. Walk away, or you'll wish you had. The warning. Robert whistled. That didn't take long. Danielle frowned. They didn't even wait for Voss to talk. Malcolm took the phone, studying the message. No traceable number. No name. Just a threat. But a rushed threat. That meant whoever was behind this was nervous. And Malcolm was going to use that. He turned to Robert. How fast can you trace the network Voss was working under? Robert smirked. Give me an hour. Danielle folded her arms. I assume walk away isn't an option for you? Malcolm chuckled. Not even close. Following the money. Back at their makeshift operations center, Robert's fingers flew across the keyboard. Lines of encrypted data scrolled past as he backtracked Voss' financial transactions. Danielle sat across from him, watching the screen. What are we looking for? Robert didn't answer immediately. Then he froze. A name appeared. Malcolm leaned in. What is it? Robert's eyes narrowed. Voss wasn't the top guy. But I think we just found someone who is. He turned the screen around. There, in bold letters, was a single name tied to dozens of offshore accounts and hidden investments. Samuel Dorian. Danielle frowned. Never heard of him. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had. And that meant things were about to get a lot more complicated. The name Samuel Dorian lingered on the screen like a shadow stretching into the unknown. Malcolm Hayes stared at it, his mind racing. This wasn't just another corrupt businessman. Dorian was something else entirely. Robert Harding noticed Malcolm's expression. You know him. Malcolm exhaled sharply. I know of him. Danielle Glass leaned forward. Care to share with the class? Malcolm rubbed his jaw, his thoughts sharpening into clarity. Dorian isn't just some crime boss. He's an international power player. Money laundering, weapons trade, data theft, he's been involved in all of it. Robert frowned. Then why isn't he in prison? Malcolm gave him a pointed look. Because people like Dorian don't get arrested. They make arrests happen. Silence filled the room. Danielle shook her head. So Voss wasn't the king. Just a knight on the board. Malcolm nodded. And now that we've taken him out, the real power behind the curtain knows our names. Robert sat back. That explains the threat Danielle got. Dorian's people must have realized we burned their operation in Prince George's County. Danielle folded her arms. So what's our next move? Because something tells me asking politely for an interview with Dorian isn't going to work. Malcolm's jaw tightened. No, but we're going to make him talk anyway. The reach of a ghost. Robert started digging into Dorian's digital footprint, but it was like chasing a ghost. Every shell company led to another. Every offshore account was masked by a different alias. But then a breakthrough. Robert froze mid-typing. Holy. Danielle frowned. What? Robert turned the screen around. There, on a secure banking ledger, was a recent transfer of $10 million from one of Dorian's hidden accounts to a high-ranking official in the Department of Justice. Malcolm's eyes darkened. He's not just above the law, he owns the law. Danielle blew out a slow breath. Well, that complicates things. A dangerous invitation. Malcolm's phone buzzed. He glanced down, expecting another anonymous threat. But instead, it was an invitation. A private event. High security. Exclusive guest list. And the host? Samuel Dorian. Malcolm smirked. Looks like we don't need to find him. He's coming to us. Danielle frowned. You're not actually thinking of going, are you? Malcolm slipped his phone into his pocket. I'm not thinking about it. I'm already going. The invitation was clear, a private event, exclusive guest list, and only the most powerful figures in attendance. And at the center of it all? Samuel Dorian. Malcolm Hayes stared at the encrypted message on his phone. It wasn't a threat. It was a challenge. Robert Harding and Danielle Glass sat across from him in their makeshift safe house, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating their faces. Danielle shook her head. This is a trap. Malcolm smirked. Of course it is. Robert leaned back. And you're still going? Malcolm's expression didn't waver. I don't have a choice. They had pushed too far, burned too many bridges. Now, the man behind it all wanted to see him up close. And Malcolm wanted the same thing. The event. The venue was pure luxury, a sprawling estate in the Virginia countryside, surrounded by high walls and armed security. Malcolm arrived alone. Dressed in a sleek black tuxedo, he blended in with the powerful and corrupt, slipping past diamond-clad socialites and billionaires with blood on their hands. He walked past foreign diplomats, whispered deals happening in every corner of the lavish ballroom. But Malcolm wasn't here for them. He was here for one man. Then he saw him. The puppet master revealed. Samuel Dorian was a ghost. A name whispered in the shadows. A man who never showed his face unless he wanted to. Yet here he was, tall, silver-haired, and radiating control. He stood near a grand fireplace, sipping a glass of expensive whiskey, a slight smirk playing on his lips. His eyes locked onto Malcolm immediately, and he beckoned him forward. Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks. Time to meet the devil. The conversation. As Malcolm approached, Dorian grinned like an old friend. Malcolm Hayes. The man who burned my operation to the ground. Malcolm didn't blink. The man who's about to burn more than that. Dorian chuckled. I admire your confidence. But let's talk about reality. He gestured to the room around them. You see these people? Senators. CEOs. Intelligence officials. The very fabric of power in this country. Dorian took another sip of whiskey. They don't fear you, Mr. Hayes. They own the system. And you? You're just a loose thread. Malcolm leaned in slightly. And yet, here you are. Inviting me. That tells me one thing. Dorian raised a brow. Oh. Malcolm's smirk sharpened. You're afraid. The warning. For the first time, Dorian's smile faltered. It lasted less than a second, but Malcolm saw it. And that meant he had an opening. Dorian set his drink down. Let me be clear, Malcolm. You've caused enough damage. I am giving you one last chance. Walk away. Malcolm's jaw tightened. And if I don't? Dorian exhaled. Then I bury you. A silent standoff. Then Malcolm smiled. You can try. Dorian studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. From behind, Malcolm felt the shift in the air. The guards were closing in. And just like that, the trap was sprung. The moment Samuel Dorian smirked, Malcolm Hayes knew he was surrounded. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of approaching footsteps, the shift in the air, the silent tightening of a noose he'd seen coming the moment he stepped into this room. Dorian sipped his whiskey, watching him like a man who had already won. You didn't really think I'd invite you here without insurance, did you? Malcolm smirked. I'd be disappointed if you did. Dorian chuckled, waving a hand. Stand down, gentlemen. Let's not turn this into a mess yet. The guards halted, but Malcolm didn't relax. Not yet. Power and leverage. Dorian stepped closer, lowering his voice. I know who you are, Malcolm. More importantly, I know what you are. Malcolm held his gaze. Then you know that I'm not afraid of you. Dorian nodded, as if amused. Fear isn't my goal. Understanding is. He gestured toward the room, filled with corrupt politicians, CEOs, intelligence officials, all mingling under crystal chandeliers. Look around you. These are the people who shape the world. And you? You are a disruption. You are chaos. Malcolm didn't blink. You say that like it's a bad thing. Dorian sighed. You're still thinking like a soldier, Malcolm. A lone warrior taking on an empire. But here's the truth. Empires don't fall because of one man. They swallow him whole. Malcolm smiled coldly. Funny. I was thinking the same thing about you. The counterplay. Dorian sighed, setting his glass down. I'll make this simple. You walk away now, and this all disappears. No charges. No retaliation. You get your life back. Malcolm tilted his head. And if I don't? Dorian's smirk returned. Then you won't have a life to get back. Silence stretched between them. Then Malcolm chuckled. Dorian raised a brow. Something funny? Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket. Instantly, the guards tensed, hands shifting toward their holsters. But Malcolm only pulled out his phone and pressed a single button. Checkmate. The giant LED screen in the ballroom glitched. For a moment, the lavish event continued, the orchestra playing, guests sipping their drinks. And then, the screen flashed to life. A video feed appeared. Dorian's smirk vanished. Because what played next was every illegal deal, every bribe, every offshore transaction he had ever made, projected in full view of the most powerful people in the country. The room froze. Whispers turned to panicked murmurs. The guests turned toward Dorian, some stepping away. Malcolm watched the fear creep into his eyes. You control the system, Dorian. But you forgot one thing. Dorian's voice was tight. And what's that? Malcolm leaned in. I control the truth. The fall begins. Before Dorian could react, the ballroom doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed inside, weapons drawn. FBI. Hands where we can see them. Screams erupted. Guests scattered. And Malcolm? He just smiled. Because this time, the trap wasn't for him. It was for Samuel Dorian. The FBI stormed the ballroom, shouting commands over the panicked chaos. Glittering champagne glasses shattered against marble floors as guests scrambled for the exits. Men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns suddenly looked like cornered rats, their carefully curated power crumbling in real time. But Samuel Dorian didn't run. He stood stone still, his icy gaze locked onto Malcolm Hayes. You think this ends with me? Dorian's voice was calm, too calm. Malcolm smirked. It ends with you tonight. Dorian didn't blink. No, Malcolm. It begins with me. The arrest. 2 FBI agents approached, their weapons drawn. Samuel Dorian, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and financial crimes against the United States government. Dorian didn't resist. Instead, he lifted his wrists, allowing the cold steel of handcuffs to snap shut. But before they let him away, he turned back to Malcolm. You've only made yourself a bigger target. Malcolm held his gaze. Good. Let them come. Dorian smiled, not a smirk, not arrogance, but something deeper, something unsettling. They already are. Then, he was dragged away. Loose ends. Robert Harding appeared at Malcolm's side, breathless. We did it. Danielle Glass followed close behind, her gun still holstered. So why don't you look happy? Malcolm didn't answer. Because Dorian's last words lingered in his mind like a warning carved into stone. They already are. The real war. 2 hours later, Malcolm stood on the balcony of a secure government facility, watching the city lights stretch into the horizon. He had won tonight. But something felt off. Robert approached, holding a tablet. We just got word. Dorian's accounts are being seized. His network is collapsing. Danielle crossed her arms. But you're still tense. What is it? Malcolm exhaled. Dorian wasn't afraid of prison. That means there's something we missed. Robert frowned. Like what? Malcolm turned to them, eyes sharp. Like the people coming next. A new name. Robert's tablet pinged, a new file appearing on screen. Malcolm leaned in, his stomach tightening. It was a single name, tied to an encrypted offshore account. A name even he didn't recognize. Lucien Cade. Danielle glanced at Malcolm. Friend of yours? Malcolm's jaw clenched. Not yet. But he would be soon. Because Dorian was just the first domino. And Malcolm had just started the real war. Malcolm Hayes stared at the name on the screen. Lucien Cade. It wasn't a name he recognized. And that was the problem. Because men like Samuel Dorian didn't fear prison, they feared the people above them. And Lucian Cade? He was above Dorian. The first clue. Robert Harding typed rapidly on his tablet, running Cade's name through every classified database he had access to. Nothing. Danielle Glass frowned. How does someone with offshore accounts and encrypted transactions not exist in any government records? Robert shook his head. Either he's a ghost or someone made him one. Malcolm exhaled. Then we find another way in. Robert's fingers flew across the screen. I'm checking Dorian's most recent communications. If Cade gave him orders, there has to be a trace somewhere. Seconds later, the screen flashed with a new hit. A message sent 3 hours before Dorian's arrest. The message. It was short, cold, efficient. The board is shifting. If he becomes a problem, remove him. There was no name attached. No signature. But the sender's location was tagged. Zurich, Switzerland. Danielle let out a low whistle. We're really going international with this, huh? Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Looks like it. Robert locked his tablet. So what's the plan? Malcolm didn't hesitate. We go to Zurich. Danielle sighed, rubbing her temples. Of course we do. Robert smirked. I'll book the flights. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he looked out the window, the city lights stretching into the distance. Samuel Dorian had been a symptom. Lucian Cade was the disease. And Malcolm Hayes was going to cut it out at the root. Zurich, Switzerland. The cold mountain air bit against Malcolm Hayes' skin as he stepped off the private charter flight. It was just past midnight. The tarmac glistened under dim runway lights, mist rolling in from the nearby hills. Zurich was beautiful, elegant, controlled. And beneath all that wealth and order, it had secrets. Malcolm had come to dig them out. Robert Harding adjusted his coat as he followed him down the stairs. I hacked the airport's entry locks. No sign of Lucian Cade flying in or out under that name. Malcolm smirked. Because a man like Cade doesn't use his real name. Danielle Glass joined them, rolling her suitcase behind her. So how do we find a ghost? Malcolm's gaze flickered toward the city skyline in the distance. We don't. We make him find us. The setup. Their first stop was a secure location, a luxury apartment Robert had arranged under a false identity. Inside, Robert pulled up encrypted banking records from Dorian's network. Danielle scanned the files over his shoulder. These offshore accounts, most are linked to real estate purchases. Malcolm leaned in. Where? Robert's fingers flew across the keyboard. One stands out. A property purchased last year through a shell company tied to Dorian's network. An estate on the outskirts of Zurich. Secluded. Private. High security. Malcolm's eyes darkened. That's where we start. The estate. They arrived just before dawn. The estate was massive, a fortress of glass and steel hidden behind electrified fences and armed security. Danielle peered through binoculars. They're running a tight operation. These guards aren't for show. Robert nodded. Thermal scans show at least a dozen inside. Possibly more underground. Malcolm's pulse remained steady. Then we go in quiet. Danielle scoffed. Since when do you do quiet? Malcolm smirked. Since now. Breaking in. The approach was precise. Malcolm moved like a shadow, slipping past infrared cameras and motion sensors. Robert remotely looped the security feeds, buying them a few minutes. Danielle took out the first guard, a quick silenced shot to the knee before knocking him out cold. Malcolm disabled another with a precise chokehold, lowering the unconscious body to the ground. They reached the main entrance. Inside, answers waited. And so did Lucian Cade. The estate was silent. Too silent. Malcolm Hayes stepped through the glass entryway, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and polished wood. Robert Harding and Danielle Glass moved behind him, their weapons drawn but steady. This was not an ordinary mansion. It was a fortress. And they had just walked into the lion's den. The first clue. Robert's fingers flew across his tablet, hijacking the estate's internal security system. His brows furrowed. Something's off. Danielle glanced at him. Define off. Robert turned the screen toward them. The security cameras are active, but there's no movement. No guards inside, no patrols. Just empty rooms. Malcolm's grip on his gun tightened. That doesn't make sense. There were at least a dozen guards outside. Danielle exhaled slowly. It's a trap. Malcolm nodded. No doubt. But he kept moving forward. The office. They found the office on the second floor, massive bookshelves, a sleek mahogany desk, and a glass wall overlooking the Swiss Alps. And sitting on the desk, waiting for them, was a laptop. Open. Active. Streaming a live video feed. The face of the enemy. Lucy and Cade stared back at them from the screen. He was calm, composed, like a man completely in control. His voice was smooth, almost amused. "Mr. Hayes, I was wondering when you'd arrive." Malcolm didn't react. "You knew I was coming." Cade's smirk deepened. "Of course. You made quite the mess with Dorian. It was only a matter of time before you followed the trail here." Danielle crossed her arms. "So where are you? Hiding behind another fortress?" Cade chuckled. "No need to hide. I simply prefer to watch from a distance." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Then why invite us here?" Cade leaned forward slightly. "To make you an offer." "The offer?" Malcolm stayed silent, waiting. Cade's smile remained. "You're good, Malcolm. Too good to waste on this losing war." Danielle scoffed. "Let me guess, you want to recruit him?" Cade didn't look at her. His focus remained on Malcolm. "I want you to see the bigger picture." Malcolm folded his arms. "Enlighten me." Cade's tone was patient, as if explaining something to a student. "You believe you're fighting corruption, exposing the rot in the system. But what if I told you there is no system?" He gestured vaguely at the camera. "Laws, governments, justice, they're all illusions, Malcolm. The real power? It's in control, influence. And I don't just own a piece of it. I decide where it moves." Malcolm stayed quiet. Cade continued. "You could have a place in this. You're too valuable to be another martyr, another name forgotten in a classified report. Join me, and I'll give you something no government ever will." Malcolm tilted his head. "And what's that?" Cade's smile was ice cold. "Control." The answer. Silence stretched. Danielle glanced at Malcolm, her grip tightening on her gun. "You're not actually considering this." Malcolm met Cade's gaze. Then he smirked. "You made one mistake, Cade." Cade raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Malcolm leaned in slightly. "You assumed I'd ever let men like you win." Then he reached forward and shut the laptop. The counterattack. The room plunged into darkness. Alarms blared. Red emergency lights flashed as the security system came back to life. Robert cursed. "He baited us. He's locking us in." Danielle raised her gun as doors slammed shut, the sound of approaching footsteps filling the air. Malcolm pulled his weapon, his pulse steady. "Then we fight our way out." Locked in. The estate's security system roared to life. Steel shutters slammed over the windows, alarms screamed, and the entire mansion shifted from a palace to a prison. Red emergency lights flickered against polished marble floors, casting long shadows as Malcolm Hayes, Robert Harding, and Danielle Glass stood back to back, guns raised. Footsteps thundered down the hallways. Armed mercenaries were closing in. Robert cursed, working furiously on his tablet. Cade sealed the exits. "We're trapped in here." Danielle checked her ammo. "Then we make a new exit." Malcolm's eyes were steady, sharp. "First, we thin the herd." The first wave. The double doors burst open. 2 armed men stormed in. Malcolm moved first. One clean shot. The first mercenary collapsed. The second fired wildly, bullets tearing through bookshelves. Danielle dropped to a knee, lined up a shot, bang. The mercenary hit the ground. More footsteps. Robert ducked behind the desk, still hacking. "There's a service tunnel beneath the mansion. If I can override the locks." Gunfire cut him off. 3 more mercs. Malcolm grabbed a chair, threw it into the hallway as a distraction, then stepped out, firing twice. 1, 2, down. The third man lunged at Danielle, but she caught his wrist, twisted, and slammed him into a glass coffee table. The fight was vicious, quick, controlled. But the mercenaries weren't stopping. Overwhelmed. A new wave rushed in. Heavier firepower, tactical precision. Malcolm and Danielle dove for cover as bullets shredded the office. Robert cursed. "They're bringing in armor." Danielle reloaded, gritting her teeth. "We need to move. Now." Malcolm looked around, mind racing. They couldn't hold this position. His eyes landed on a glass wall overlooking the balcony. Weak point. Malcolm turned to Robert. "You got that tunnel open yet?" Robert's fingers flew across the screen. "Almost." Danielle fired 3 quick shots, covering him. "We don't have almost." The mercenaries regrouped, taking cover. One pulled out a grenade. Malcolm saw it the moment he did. The escape plan. "Down." Malcolm tackled Robert as the grenade soared through the air. It detonated, boom. The explosion ripped through the room, sending glass and debris flying. Malcolm hit the ground hard, ears ringing. Danielle was already pulling him up. "Move." Smoke filled the air. The mercenaries closed in, ready to finish the job. And that's when Robert shouted, "Go!" The tunnel's open. Malcolm's eyes locked onto the hatch beneath the office rug, now glowing green. He grabbed Danielle, motioning for Robert. "Go first." Robert dove into the tunnel. Danielle covered them, firing at the advancing enemies. Malcolm was the last one in, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Gunfire rattled the steel above them. But they were in. They had escaped, for now. The chase continues. The underground tunnel stretched into darkness. Danielle panted. "Where does this lead?" Robert checked the map. "There's an exit 2 miles north. But if Cade knows we're down here." Malcolm wiped blood from his forehead. "Then we don't stop moving." Because this wasn't over. Lucy and Cade was still out there. And Malcolm was going to find him. The tunnel. The underground passage was cold and damp, the scent of wet stone and stale air thick around them. The only light came from the glow of Robert Harding's tablet screen, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Malcolm Hayes moved quickly, gun drawn, pulse steady. Danielle Glass followed close behind, her breathing controlled but sharp. "Tell me we're not running straight into another trap." Robert adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the map. "If we keep moving north, there's an access point that leads to an abandoned train station. That's our best shot at getting out clean." Malcolm nodded. "Then let's move." But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Lucy and Cade had set a trap. Malcolm had sprung it. And now, Cade was watching, waiting, planning his next move. A warning from the past. As they ran, Malcolm's mind flashed back to something Samuel Dorian had said before his arrest. "You've only made yourself a bigger target." Dorian hadn't been bluffing. The moment Malcolm burned his operation, the real power behind it, Cade's network, had activated. And now, they weren't just trying to kill him. They were studying him. The outside world. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the exit. Robert worked quickly, overriding the lock. The rusted metal door groaned open, revealing the outside. The Swiss countryside stretched before them, rolling hills, an old railway station just visible in the distance. Danielle sighed in relief. Fresh air. Finally. Malcolm wasn't comforted. His instincts screamed danger. They were out of the trap. But that didn't mean they were safe. The next step. Robert adjusted his bag. "We need to regroup. Find out where Cade is operating from." Malcolm checked his ammo. "He's expecting us to run." "We're not going to." Danielle arched a brow. "Then what?" Malcolm's gaze hardened. "We hunt him." A beat of silence. Then Robert smirked. "Now we're talking." Danielle cracked her knuckles. "All right then. Let's find the bastard." Because this war? It was just beginning. Zurich, safe house. The safe house was a minimalist apartment buried deep in the city, the kind of place that didn't officially exist. Untraceable lease, burner utilities, cash payments. Inside, the glow of multiple screens lit the darkened space. Robert Harding hunched over his tablet, typing furiously. "I've scraped every financial record, offshore account, and coded message we could link to Cade." Danielle Glass leaned against the window, watching the streets below. And Robert's fingers froze mid-keystroke. Then, he exhaled sharply. "Got him." Malcolm Hayes stepped closer. "Where?" Robert turned the screen around. A highly encrypted transaction, processed less than 6 hours ago. Destination, Istanbul, Turkey. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "That's where he's running his operation?" Robert shook his head. "No, that's where he's waiting." The setup. Danielle crossed her arms. "We just barely got out of Zurich in one piece. Now we're going straight into another hot zone." Malcolm didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." Lucy and Cade wasn't just running. He was baiting them, testing them. And Malcolm was done playing defense. The plan. Robert pulled up a satellite image of the Istanbul location. It's an underground club in Beyoğlu. High-end clientele. No digital footprint. If Cade is there, he won't be alone. Malcolm's eyes flickered over the map. "Then we go in smart." Danielle smirked. "You mean not kicking down the front door and starting a gunfight?" Malcolm smiled slightly. "Not this time." The flight. For hours later, they were airborne, flying into Istanbul under assumed identities. Malcolm sat quietly, staring out at the clouds. Cade was waiting for him. But this time, Malcolm was coming for him. And when they met, one of them wasn't walking away. Istanbul, Beyoğlu district. The streets of Istanbul pulsed with life. Vendors called out in rapid Turkish, neon signs flickered above crowded alleyways, and the scent of spiced meats and strong coffee filled the air. But Malcolm Hayes wasn't here for the scenery. He, Robert Harding and Danielle Glass stood across the street from the club, a sleek, underground hideout known only to criminal elites and power brokers. And somewhere inside, Lucy and Cade was waiting. The approach. Robert adjusted the collar of his suit jacket. Security's tight. No weapons allowed inside. Biometric ID scans at the entrance. Danielle smirked. Good thing we don't plan on following the rules. Malcolm checked his watch. We go in separate. Less chance of being made. Robert nodded. I'll work on disabling their security grid from inside. Danielle flipped her hair back, adjusting the small concealed blade in her belt. And I'll keep eyes on Cade's guards. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Let's do this. Inside the club, the interior was a haze of dim lights, expensive whiskey, and whispered conversations. Men in tailored suits. Women in designer dresses. Armed enforcers watching from the shadows. And at the center of it all, Lucy and Cade. Malcolm spotted him immediately, seated in a VIP booth, sipping from a crystal glass, completely at ease. Their eyes met. Cade smirked. Malcolm didn't blink. The first move. Malcolm approached slowly, sliding into the booth across from Cade. Istanbul suits you, he said evenly. Cade chuckled. So does Zurich. So did New York. Power isn't about location, Malcolm. It's about control. Malcolm leaned forward. You're running out of both. Cade swirled his drink. Am I? A pause. Then Cade snapped his fingers. The guards at the entrance locked the doors. Danielle tensed. Malcolm. Robert's voice crackled in Malcolm's earpiece. They just activated private security protocols. We're boxed in. Cade smiled. Now, let's talk. Malcolm didn't move. Didn't flinch. Because this wasn't a negotiation. It was the beginning of the end. The lion and the wolf. The club grew deathly silent. Lucy and Cade sat calmly, his glass of whiskey untouched. The air between him and Malcolm Hayes crackled with unspoken violence. The doors were sealed. The guards were in place. And Malcolm knew exactly what this was. A test. A game. A battle of minds before the bullets started flying. Cade exhaled slowly. You're impressive, Malcolm. I'll give you that. But this little crusade of yours ends tonight. Malcolm smirked. Funny. I was about to say the same thing. The power play. Cade leaned forward, voice smooth. You don't understand how deep this goes. I don't run a simple crime syndicate. I control information. Governments. Entire economies. His eyes darkened. You can kill me, but you can't kill the system. Malcolm's fingers tapped against the table. I don't need to kill the system. I just need to burn the right piece of it. Cade chuckled. And what piece is that? Malcolm's earpiece crackled. Robert Harding's voice came through. We're in. The financial network, the shell companies, everything's being exposed right now. Global media outlets just received the files. Cade's smirk faded. For the first time, Malcolm saw it. Fear. The collapse begins. The club's security team panicked. Phones buzzed in pockets. Messages poured in. Cade's empire was crumbling in real time. Danielle Glass whispered, checkmate. Cade's jaw tightened. You think you've won? Malcolm stood slowly. No, Cade. I know I have. The first shot. Cade lunged. Malcolm moved first. One shot. The bullet hit Cade's shoulder, sending him crashing against the table. Screams erupted. Guards drew their weapons. Danielle spun, firing. Robert's voice shouted in Malcolm's earpiece. Get out now. Malcolm ignored the chaos. He grabbed Cade by the collar, yanking him close. You built an empire on control. And tonight, you lost it all. Cade's eyes burned with fury. Malcolm let him go, letting him fall into his own ruin. Then, he turned and walked away. Because Lucy and Cade was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. Istanbul, the aftermath. Malcolm Hayes stepped out of the club and into the cold Istanbul night. Behind him, the world of Lucy and Cade was crumbling. Inside, gunfire still echoed as panic spread through his organization. Malcolm didn't look back. He never did. The escape. Danielle Glass and Robert Harding were already moving, slipping through a side alley where a black SUV idled, waiting. Robert yanked open the door. We need to go. Now. Malcolm slid into the back seat. Danielle climbed in after, gun still in hand. That went well. Malcolm smirked. Define well. Robert pulled up a news feed on his tablet. The leak hit. Cade's entire network is public. The world knows everything: offshore accounts, government bribes, blackmail operations. Danielle whistled. They'll tear each other apart trying to stay out of prison. Malcolm nodded. Good. Saves us the trouble. But one thing still nagged at him. The final move. Cade was a strategist. A manipulator. He would have had a failsafe. Malcolm turned to Robert. What about Cade himself? Robert hesitated. The security feeds cut out when we left. Turkish authorities are swarming the place now. There's no sign of him. Danielle's expression darkened. You're saying he escaped? Robert frowned. I'm saying, we don't know. A heavy silence. Malcolm stared out the window, jaw clenched. He had won the war. But the enemy? Might still be breathing. No loose ends. Danielle sighed. So what now? We celebrate. Malcolm's eyes were cold, unreadable. Not yet. Robert and Danielle exchanged glances. Robert cleared his throat. You think he's still out there? Malcolm nodded. If he is, we find him. Danielle smirked. And if we don't? Malcolm leaned back, the city lights reflecting in his gaze. Then we wait. Because if Lucy and Cade was still alive, he'd come for Malcolm. And Malcolm would be ready. Istanbul, 48 hours later. The sun had just begun to rise over the Bosphorus, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. But Malcolm Hayes wasn't admiring the view. He stood on the balcony of their safe house, gripping a cup of strong Turkish coffee, his mind still locked on Lucy and Cade. 2 days. 2 days since they burned Cade's empire to the ground. And yet, no body. No confirmation. Just silence. Danielle Glass stepped beside him, arms crossed. You're still thinking about him? Malcolm didn't answer. She sighed. We won, Malcolm. Cade's network is collapsing. His allies are scattering. His money is worthless. Even if he's alive, he's powerless. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Men like Cade don't stay powerless for long. Danielle rolled her eyes. So what? We keep chasing ghosts? Malcolm exhaled. Until I see a body, I don't trust that he's gone. Robert's intel. Robert Harding emerged from inside, holding his tablet. I checked the morgues, the hospitals, even black market smuggling routes. No sign of Cade leaving Istanbul. Danielle smirked. See? He's dead. But Robert wasn't smiling. He turned the screen toward them. A single message, sent from an encrypted source. Shadows never die, Malcolm. Neither do kings. See you soon. Malcolm stared at the words. Danielle's smirk disappeared. Tell me that's a fake. Robert's voice was grim. It came from a burner phone near the Syrian border. Someone wanted us to see it. Silence. Then Malcolm set his coffee down. Cade's alive. The next war. Danielle cursed. Damn it. So what now? Robert sighed. If he's smart, he'll stay in hiding. Lick his wounds. Malcolm's expression was unreadable. No. He'll rebuild. And when he does, his fingers tightened around his gun. We'll be waiting. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere near the Syrian border. Lucy and Cade stared at the burning cigarette in his hand, watching the embers glow against the cold desert night. The safe house was simple, nothing like his former palaces of power. No luxury, no security teams, no sprawling bank accounts to call upon. For the first time in years, he was nothing. But not for long. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the dim light. Cade didn't flinch. Is everything in place? The man nodded. Our contacts in Russia and the Middle East are still loyal. The cleanup is underway. Within a month, the world will forget about you. Cade exhaled slowly, flicking the cigarette into the sand. Good. Now let's talk about Malcolm Hayes. The man hesitated. He won't stop. Cade's smile was razor-sharp. I'm counting on that. Because revenge? It was best served slow. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. Back at NSA headquarters, Malcolm Hayes pored over intelligence reports, every lead, every whisper tied to Cade's name. Robert Harding walked in, dropping a fresh report onto the desk. Cade's not just surviving. He's planning something. Danielle Glass leaned against the doorway. So what's our move? Malcolm's gaze was cold. We go hunting. Because this time, he wouldn't wait for Cade to strike first. NSA headquarters, Washington, D.C. Malcolm Hayes sat in a dimly lit operations room, the glow of multiple monitors casting sharp shadows across his face. On the screen, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and classified intelligence reports. All pointing to one thing. Lucy and Cade was moving again. Robert Harding stood beside him, scrolling through a fresh data dump. We found something. Danielle Glass leaned against the table. Please tell me it's a location and not just another dead end. Robert smirked. It's better than that. He tapped the screen. A shipment manifest, heavy weapons, untraceable, scheduled for transport out of northern Syria. And the name tied to it? A shell company connected to Cade's old network. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He's arming himself. Danielle crossed her arms. So what's the play? Malcolm's gaze darkened. We intercept the shipment. Cut him off before he can rebuild. The setup. Robert pulled up the logistics. Shipment leaves a secure compound in 48 hours. Destination, an unknown buyer in Eastern Europe. Danielle smirked. Let me guess, this is a smash and grab. Malcolm nodded. We take the shipment. And if we're lucky, he looked at the screen, at Cade's name buried in the data. We take him too. Wheels up. By nightfall, they were in the air, heading straight into enemy territory. Cade thought he could disappear. But Malcolm wasn't just chasing a ghost. He was hunting it. Northern Syria, 48 hours later. The desert night was cold and silent, stretching endlessly beneath a sky littered with stars. Malcolm Hayes lay prone on a ridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the makeshift compound below. A convoy of armored trucks sat inside the perimeter, Cade's shipment. Armed guards patrolled the grounds, their shadows flickering against the floodlights. Danielle Glass's voice crackled through Malcolm's earpiece. Tell me you have eyes on our package. Malcolm smirked. I see it. 6 trucks. Heavy security. Robert Harding's voice followed. Surveillance drones confirm heat signatures. 15, maybe 20 hostiles. Danielle scoffed. That's all. I was hoping for a challenge. Malcolm checked his watch. We hit them in 10. The approach. Robert remotely looped the perimeter cameras, buying them precious seconds of stealth. Danielle and Malcolm moved fast, slipping through the shadows, knives drawn. One guard never heard the blade slice his throat. Another barely had time to register Malcolm before a silence shot dropped him. 2 down. 18 to go. The fight erupts. They reached the first truck, but before Malcolm could signal for the next step, a radio crackled. Intruders, north side. Damn. They'd been made. Gunfire exploded across the compound. Danielle dived for cover, returning fire. Malcolm rolled behind a crate, taking out 2 men with precise shots. Robert's panicked voice came through the comms. Reinforcements inbound, 3 minutes out. Malcolm reloaded. Then we finish this in 2. The extraction. Danielle sprinted toward the first truck, hot-wiring the ignition. Malcolm covered her, laying down fire as she gunned the engine. Robert's voice crackled. I'm bringing in air support. Get the hell out of there. Malcolm climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut. Drive. Danielle punched the gas. Behind them, the compound erupted into chaos. But as they roared into the night, one thought burned in Malcolm's mind. They had the shipment. But Cade? He was still out there. And Malcolm was closer than ever. Northern Syria, the open road. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, the roar of the stolen truck drowning out the echoes of gunfire behind them. Malcolm Hayes sat in the passenger seat, reloading his weapon, eyes locked on the side mirror. Dust clouds billowed in the distance. Robert Harding's voice crackled through the comms. You've got hostiles on your tail, 3 vehicles, heavily armed. Danielle Glass gritted her teeth, gripping the wheel. They really don't want us leaving with this shipment, do they? Malcolm smirked. Too bad for them. He rolled down the window, steadied his aim, then fired. The pursuit. The first SUV swerved as a bullet shattered its windshield. The driver lost control, spinning into the sand dunes. Danielle laughed. 1 down. Robert's voice came in sharp. 2 more. And they've got a mounted turret. Malcolm cursed. The second vehicle accelerated, a gunner perched in the back opening fire. Bullets ripped through metal, sparks flying as the rounds tore into the truck. Danielle swerved. We can't outrun them forever. Malcolm's mind raced. Then, an idea. The trap. He turned to Danielle. Hold steady. I'm going outside. Danielle's eyes widened. Are you insane? Malcolm was already moving. He climbed onto the roof of the truck, wind howling around him. The enemy gunner turned his sights on him. Malcolm dropped to one knee, aimed. 1 shot. The gunner slumped forward, lifeless. Danielle veered hard, slamming the second SUV off the road. The last vehicle remained. Face to face. Malcolm recognized the driver. A man he'd seen before, one of Cade's personal enforcers. Their eyes met through the windshield. Malcolm raised his gun. The driver grinned and pressed a detonator. The explosion. Boom. The truck lurched violently as a blast erupted from the road behind them. Flames and debris filled the air. Danielle fought for control, skidding wildly. Hold on. Malcolm braced himself as the truck barreled forward, tires screaming against the dirt. Finally, the enemy was gone. Victory, for now. Robert's voice came through. Jesus, are you two still alive? Danielle exhaled. Barely. Malcolm climbed back inside, wiping dust from his face. We got what we came for. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Kate had expected this attack. And the detonator? It meant he was closer than they thought. Danielle glanced at him. What's next? Malcolm's grip tightened. We end this. Beirut, Lebanon, 72 hours later. The city was alive with movement. Crowded streets, neon lights flickering above old stone alleys, the scent of grilled meats and diesel thick in the air. But Malcolm Hayes wasn't here for the scenery. He was here for Lucy and Kate. Robert Harding had traced one final lead, a luxury penthouse in the heart of Beirut, secured under an alias that tied back to Cade's old shell companies. It was his last known location. Danielle Glass adjusted the silencer on her pistol. If we go in fast. Malcolm nodded. No mistakes. No loose ends. Because after everything, this was where it ended. The infiltration. They moved through the back entrance, bypassing security with Robert's hacked keycard codes. The penthouse was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Danielle raised an eyebrow. You sure he's here? Malcolm's gut twisted. He's here. He could feel it. Face to face. As they entered the main suite, a single figure stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city skyline. Lucy and Kate. He turned slowly, a half-smile playing at his lips. I was wondering when you'd come. Malcolm didn't blink. It's over. Cade chuckled. Is it? The final offer. Cade walked toward the bar, pouring himself a drink. You could kill me, Malcolm. But ask yourself, what happens next? He swirled the whiskey in his glass. You think taking me out stops all of this? There will always be another man in the shadows. Always another name on a bank account. Another war to fight. He took a sip. Or, his eyes locked on Malcolm. We could work together. Danielle stiffened. Are you serious? Cade smirked. I know power, Malcolm. And I know you. You don't just want revenge, you want control. You want to fix the system. I can help you do that. Silence. Then, Malcolm raised his gun. I already fixed the system. And pulled the trigger. The fall of Cade. Cade staggered back, blood blooming across his chest. His glass shattered against the marble floor. He gasped, shock flickering in his eyes. Then he collapsed. Danielle let out a slow breath. Finally, Malcolm stood over the body. No words. Just an ending. The exit. Robert's voice crackled in the comms. I take it that's done. Malcolm holstered his weapon. Yeah, it's done. They left the penthouse without looking back. Because Lucy and Cade? He wasn't coming back. The final move. Back in Washington, Malcolm stood at the edge of the NSA headquarters, looking out over the city. Danielle sipped her coffee. So what now? Robert smirked. I hear there's always another bad guy. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Cade was gone. But the world? It still needed fixing. And Malcolm Hayes? He wasn't done yet. Washington, D.C., 3 weeks later. The sun had barely risen over the sea. He stood in a quiet park. Pedestrians hurried to work. Taxis weaved through traffic. To them, nothing had changed. But Malcolm knew better. Lucy and Cade was gone. His empire dismantled, his fortune erased, his name wiped from the world like a bad memory. But the war? It never really ended. A new beginning. Danielle Glass arrived, handing him a second cup of coffee. You look like a man thinking too much. Malcolm smirked. I always am. Robert Harding strolled up, tablet in hand. The media is still chasing ghosts. Some think Cade fled, others think he was assassinated. Danielle raised an eyebrow. And the truth? Malcolm took a sip of his coffee. The truth doesn't matter. Only the result. Robert smirked. You really have gone full spymaster, huh? Malcolm didn't answer. Because the truth was, this was just the beginning. The next fight. Robert swiped across his tablet. There's chatter in Eastern Europe. A new player stepping into Cade's old space. Danielle sighed. It never ends, does it? Malcolm set down his empty coffee cup. No. And that's why we don't stop. He turned, walking toward the street, toward his next fight. Because the world was still broken. And Malcolm Hayes? He was going to fix it. One mission at a time.